And welcome to the latest edition of SA Explained. And we're going to tie in very neatly for you what is happening in the Northern Hemisphere at the moment, more specifically what is happening in the Middle East. We are getting up to almost a week since the invasion. Some are calling it an invasion, some are calling it an armed conflict, others are calling it a war. Maybe we'll get into that, what has been happening between the US, Israel and Iran. We now know, of course, this conflict has gone far beyond those borders. Countries that ordinarily would not have been involved in something like this have been dragged into this conflict. We're going to understand what it means for that part of the world, what it means perhaps from the economy side. I will touch on oil as well, but also what it means for you here in South Africa. How do we position ourselves? How do we make sense of what this means for us here in the southern parts of the African continent? Apart from that, we'll be understanding what's going to be happening next. Where's the timeline? How long is a piece of string? Aakash, I've dragged him in to try and make sense of this for us. And Aakash, good to have you on the podcast as always. Before we talk about the why and the where and the what next, we need to just orientate ourselves. Almost a week later, where are we today?
I think we at the end of the first phase, and that is more or less air superiority over the Iranian skies. And I think yesterday we had a very clear idea that that had been achieved when some of the international airlines, including Emirates, decided to open or reopen certain routes for traveling. And that basically indicated that the Americans and the Israelis more or less dominate the skies, or certainly a large part of the sky over the Middle East. So the end of phase one, the supreme leader of Iran has been taken over. The Americans and the Israelis have ensured some degree of air superiority. And the million-dollar question, what happens now?
What happens now? And we're going to get there in just a moment, because when you talk about the fact that we are seeing commercial airliners back in the air, it's not just the air superiority. You're obviously quite right. But what we're seeing, as we have been this past few weeks, is these sort of surface-to-air missiles, which is obviously no longer a threat. I remember hearing from the White House earlier this week that it is phase one, you're correct, but there's a two-pronged approach here. One was air superiority, which they've achieved. We now have the ships off the coast in that region, which we'll get to, but it's the safety of ensuring no missiles are being launched at commercial airliners as they're taking off as well. And I've seen some of the videos on social, that some of the early flights out of Dubai, out of that region, are actually being escorted by jets. So while we're getting the commercial airliners back up in the air, there is still a concern, which is why they're adding these jets there as well. They're being very careful how they're doing this.
Well, I think what the Americans and the Israelis did very successfully is their ability to take out the missile launchers. Because you can have 1,000 missiles. If you don't have the ability to launch them, it becomes a problem.
Right.
So the strategy was, and this took a few days to achieve, have some sort of eye in the sky, and whenever a missile is launched, you target the launcher. And in that way, we have seen over the last 6 days, from day one, the number of missile launches decreasing dramatically. I'm not sure that the Iranians would have had the ability to shoot down a commercial aircraft. But certainly some of the missiles, the long-range missiles that they were trying to lob into some of the neighboring states, could have hit a commercial plane, which would have been very problematic. Hence the fighter escorts.
Now we have to talk about the why of all of this. When it first came out, there was two versions that we were being given as far as Israel and the USA was concerned. Oddly enough, a best kept secret in modern international relations. Apparently, Israel and the US have been working on this for months. Thousands of hours, we're told, went into the planning of all of this. But my point is this: there was two reasons we were given. One was the official line that this is about preventing Iran's continued production of interballistic missiles, or IBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And the other one was their nuclear proliferation for various other reasons. The other version we were given was regime change, but no one wanted to say that at the time. Now, a few days later, what do you think it might have really been about? Was this about IBMs and nuclear proliferation, or was this actually about regime change? Because the second one is far more complicated to manage than just stopping IBMs.
So there was no direct threat, if you look at it logically, to the American homeland, to American territory. Even with the missiles that Iran poses, they certainly don't have the capacity to reach that distance. In terms of the nuclear program, well, Trump very triumphantly told us some months ago that Iran's nuclear program had effectively been destroyed. On the other hand, Iran has continually said that they don't want nuclear weapons. In fact, the former supreme leader had issued a fatwa saying that we will use nuclear power for peaceful means, generate electricity, etc., but certainly not to acquire a nuclear weapon. So, why did Iran or why did the Americans and the Israelis do this? Well, there could be a number of reasons, but I think it's a lot to do with ensuring the safety of Israel. Iran was Iran's biggest threat in the Middle East, and given the fact that the Israelis have effectively neutralized all the proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis to some extent in the Middle East, it made sense from a security perspective, from an Israeli perspective, to ensure that there was a new government in Iran. Otherwise, the threat, despite all of the successes that Israel has had militarily, the threat of an Iran remained.
It does remain. And I think this is where it's more complicated. I don't want to dig down too much into, unless you'd like to, of course, the history of Iran leadership and Ayatollah Khamenei and how long he's been in power. But the regime change is far trickier to A, manage, but also B, to predict as well. Because you and I both know this. When there is a leader, and we can go to the annals of history, Saddam Hussein, Muammar Gaddafi. Yes, you might take out the well-known leader, but you are going to leave a vacuum. And that's a lot more difficult to sort of substantiate, to measure, to predict, and to react to.
And look, I think the big difference here is that this was not just any leader. This was a leader of a very big country. From a population size, from a landmass size, it's a massive country. Secondly, taking out the Ayatollah was akin to taking out a Christian pope, the Roman Catholic pope. And as a result, it comes with very deep consequences. Yes, there are people who completely despised him, but there's a vast majority of the Shiite population that absolutely adored him. So what is America's ultimate agenda? Was it to merely take him out? Because if that was it, they've achieved
done
that.
it. Yeah.
If it was getting rid of the current regime, well, that's a far more complex problem, because at some point, will the Americans put boots on the ground? Will the Israelis put boots on the ground? And that changes the dimension of the war that we've seen thus far. It's relatively simple for the Americans and for the Israelis to hit Iran from the air, but to physically commit men to the ground, that's a little bit more complicated, because it comes with the cost of human life.
It does. And the international relations perspective of this gets important. Before we talk about South Africa, what we would have ordinarily had, if you looked at the first few hours of this attack, this armed conflict last Saturday, it would have been a US, Israel attack on Iran. Iran would have responded, no real surprise. However, what I'm wondering about, maybe boots on the ground and who is going to be involved in the next steps for Iran. As a result of what we've seen, they've involved other countries, Qatar, Bahrain, Dubai. They've had to retaliate as well, defend themselves and i.e. retaliate. I can't help but imagine they're going to want a seat at this table. Those states aren't going to just allow Israel and the US to dictate what happens next. Because if you look geographically where Iran is, their next door neighbors are going to be Dubai, going to be Bahrain, going to be Qatar. They're going to want to have a say on what happens next, because they're going to worry about the next few weeks, the next few months, the next few years. They're going to want to have a say here.
So we can't just look at it from a country perspective. There's also a layer below that, which is from a religious perspective, that Iran is predominantly Shiite, and many of the countries that have been attacked are Sunni. And there's that religious dimension that also comes into play that one has to take into account. But absolutely, and this is the great fear, and this is where it kind of works into Iran's favor, because the more countries that you suck into this conflict, the more long drawn out, the more complicated it becomes. what Donald Trump wanted was a surgical operation. That's what ideally he would have wanted. The type of operation that he did against Maduro in Venezuela. You go in, it takes a couple of hours, you bring the guy out, and you're done and you're dusted. His best case scenario for Iran, initially he said 4 to 6 weeks. And we can see that within a week, the Americans and the Israelis have this air superiority. But what's the end game? Was it to just topple the Ayatollah, or was it regime change? And if it's regime change, it's a lot more complicated.
It is, especially when you look at the leadership structures within that particular regime, who's going to now take over, because it's easy to focus on Ayatollah Khamenei and the other generals, even the son of Khamenei coming in. We know that didn't last very long as well. And it's this issue that the US and the Israelis are going to have to look at now. If not them, who? And do they even know who that person is? Is there any room here, do you think, beyond these initial confrontations for a diplomatic solution? Or is this just bomb and shoot and kill into submission?
Well, the Americans have put on the table, although it's not a very firm suggestion, the former Shah's son, who was exiled and continues to live in America.
Very vocal against the regime.
Very vocal against the regime. But I mean, that's also a failed experiment, because if you go back in history, his grandfather was, in fact, during World War II, the leader, the Shah in Iran. And when the Russians, the Soviets, and the British invaded Iran, he abdicated. Interestingly enough, he settled in South Africa. He initially moved to Mauritius, spent a short while in Durban, and then lived in a suburb in Johannesburg, where he died, if I remember correctly, in 1944. At that particular point, the Iranians had embarked on some sort of democracy project. They had installed a new democratic leader, and the Americans came in and toppled that leader. The current guy who lives in America, his dad, was then installed. And in 1979, he was kicked out in the Islamic Revolution. So the lineage has not been particularly successful in Iran. And there's no reason to suggest that now it would.
Which leaves this open-ended question of who, what will they do, why will they do it, and who will they work with or not work with. Another interesting one from this week, and I saw this got a lot of coverage on the internet and obviously social media. If I'm not mistaken, there was the sinking of this Iranian submarine, the sinking of this Iranian ship via a torpedo, I think it was. And I had to go and check this because it has been at least the best part of 4 decades, 5 decades since the US has used a torpedo successfully against any other naval vessel. It was very dramatic footage, but it did seem a bit archaic at the time, but clearly very effective, which just then means you're talking air superiority earlier, now also potentially on the waves as well.
So the sinking of this Iranian sub is fascinating because this particular sub was undergoing military operations in India. And interestingly enough, South Africa's Navy, our frigate, the SAS Amatola, was part of that Indian Navy exercises, the maritime exercises. And one of the protocols whenever you take part in such a military or a naval exercise is that you come to the host country unarmed. So here was this Iranian naval vessel that was heading back home unarmed and was attacked. On the other hand, America and Iran theoretically, not officially, but theoretically are at war. So was the naval vessel fair game? And I think that's the type of question that's going to result in a whole lot of interesting debates going forward. But it also changes the scope of warfare because the Iranians will now take as fair game, fair target, any American vessel at any port, at any point in any sea. And in the future, it makes it a far more complicated situation. So on one hand, the Americans have been very triumphantly talking about how they took out this particular, I think it was a corvette or a frigate. But on the other hand, it changes the game. The rules have been thrown out out of the window.
The rules of engagement have changed. And on those rules of engagement, here's what's also going to change if we just zoom away from this frigate or this corvette, this particular incident as well. Because I do want to talk about our relationship as South Africa with Iran. But the rules of engagement are now going to change. If you look at how the US and Israel approached this armed conflict, there are going to be other leaders, sort of an international relations perspective here. There are going to be other leaders that are going to be looking at how America is conducting itself along with a major ally like Israel. And these other wars around the world, I'll give some examples, and I'm sure there's more, but the few I can think of now: Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan. We also have the long-standing issue between North Korea and South Korea. I can't help but think the aggressor leader in all of those other wars I mentioned are going to look at how America and Israel have conducted themselves here. My concern is this might become a bit of a free-for-all. Well, if America can do it, and Trump is the chairperson of the Board of Peace, the irony is not lost on me there, they're going to look at that and go, well, if they can do it, we can do it.
Well, we're back in the Wild West, aren't we?
Aren't we?
It's a case of where might is right. The stronger you are, the greater freedom you have to do as you see fit. And this is the dilemma that the world now faces. Remember that the Americans and Iranians, hours before the attacks began, were sitting down in Switzerland and having talks about how they can find a common peace. They undertook to resume those talks. There was a feeling when the talks broke that a solution could be found, perhaps in the near future. And the talks were simply ignored, and the military option was pursued. And that changes everything in the world. And as you point out, every other country would be looking upon this. A precedent has been set that will now be followed. And worryingly, all countries will now be looking at beefing up their own security.
And you took me so nicely, Aakash, to our own military, our own defense systems, our own armed services, if that's the term we're going to use now. Because we spoke earlier about Iran. They were here in South Africa. They were part of these naval exercises. That frigate, the corvette, the vessel that you spoke about was on its way back home unarmed. We do have a relationship with Iran, but I wonder if you can just help me understand, as the muggle in the room, what is that relationship and how does it change our stance on what is happening up north?
In fact, we have a very confusing relationship with Iran. And to understand our relationship with Iran, we've got to go back to the days of apartheid. And in the 1970s, the Shah, the guy who lives in America, his dad visited South Africa, met with then Prime Minister B.J. Foster. And they had an agreement that South Africa would provide arms to Iran, and in return, Iran would provide oil to South Africa. In fact, it could be argued that had Iran not done that, the apartheid regime would have crumbled a lot faster, because Iran fueled the South African economy during the sanctions period of apartheid. So, come 1994 and more recently, and this love affair that the ANC has with Iran is very difficult to explain. It's very difficult to understand because the Iranians helped prop up the apartheid regime. And in return, the South Africans provided Iran with certain weapons. So we have, and we would have seen them on our Armed Forces Day, the G5 long-range artillery piece. Iran possesses those. They got them from South Africa.
Oh.
Now, back in the 1980s, South Africa was a leader in drone technology. And we developed the Seeker drone. It was literally a pioneer at the time. And many argue that that technology was re-engineered by the Iranians and formed the basis of what's now become their drone program. So South Africa has this rather weird relationship because you would think that countries that supported apartheid, the current democratic dispensation, would want to keep at an arm's length like they do with Israel. But in the case of Iran, that's simply not the case.
On the Israel thing, I was going to ask about the Israel thing. We have to talk about this. It's a complicated relationship at the best of times, but now you got these two warring nations, and almost geographically, but also from an ideology perspective, we are I don't want to say we're the ugly stepchild, but we are stuck between these two because we're trying to maintain cordial relations, although there are issues with Israel, of course, and the Palestine ongoing issue there. We have a very, very thin line to tread. I'm starting to wonder, though, if we even know as a government where that line is. Where do we start to maneuver here?
In the years immediately after democracy, South Africa had a very clear-cut foreign policy. It was a policy of non-alignment, and as a result, Mandela visited a whole host of different leaders, including Fidel Castro, and it was seen as okay. But Mandela also had the type of gravitas that allowed him to be able to do something of that sort. So he could sit down and have tea with the British Queen, and at the same time he could have, or days later have coffee with Fidel Castro, and absolutely nobody would batter an eyelid. But times have changed, and South Africa certainly doesn't pack the diplomatic punch that we once did. We've lost the moral high ground, and when it comes to, some of the guys that we call our closest friends, Iran, even Russia, they are certainly not the type of friends that America keeps. And at the end of the day, the Americans are the biggest economy, and we know they're by far the biggest military power. And it's a question that South Africa has to very carefully consider going forward, because if we continue on this path, we will become increasingly isolated.
And this is where the business argument comes in. When I say the business argument, I mean you and Francis Hurd and Rapio Madzena have spoken about this to various experts over the years as well. We keep having this AGOA discussion versus BRICS, and I still can't help but get a sense that South Africa is trying to play Switzerland. We're trying to keep. It's like being the child of divorced parents. You get some this weekend, some that weekend. Everyone's trying to be the nice guy. Do we need to reach a point as South Africa where we actually pick a side? Because right now we're straddling the fence. We want to go it because it's beneficial, but we also want to be part of BRICS. And the two at some point are going to converge and I imagine split, and we're going to have to make a call.
Look, what we say is not in keeping with what we do.
Mm-hmm.
So we say we want to be non-aligned, but we take on Israel. And as a result, the point at which you take on Israel, you automatically take on the Americans.
Yeah.
And therein lies the dilemma. South Africa's problem also is that South Africa bases its argument on a moral judgment. And moral judgments are basically opinions. They're not necessarily rooted in fact, although our attempt to go to the ICJ is an attempt to try and establish and put down certain facts about the matter. But right now, South Africa is not seen favorably from a diplomatic perspective. The people that we call our friends are highly questionable in certain quarters of the world. But those are the quarters that are also important from an economic perspective.
And it takes me to my last question, because all of this is very important for the entire country to understand how we got to this point. So we got to this point, you and I are on the highway. At some point, there's an off-ramp here for everyone watching, ordinary South Africans, those that aren't involved in IR, international relations, and politics. What does any of this do for the average South African watching now? Obviously, the oil, we're going to keep a close eye on. I mean, we could be up, R4 for the next fuel price increase. That's a big one for most people. Beyond that, and including that, what do most South Africans need to worry about, pay attention to, keep a lookout for going forward, however long this conflict lasts?
So if this conflict is short, the implications for South Africans will not be dire. It'll peter itself out. When I say short, if the Americans are looking at regime change, an external power, alternatively the Iranians themselves revolt and overthrow their government, and the Americans get a person as the leader that they're comfortable with. The chances of that happening, though, I must point out, are not necessarily the best. The long-term scenario is that the Iranians succeed in closing the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil supplies pass. And there's one added dimension, that South Africa doesn't necessarily import vast quantities of crude oil anymore. We buy refined product because we've lost our ability by and largely to refine crude oil into petrol and diesel. So we buy the finished product. If one of or two of the refineries in the Middle East are hit, it's going to impact the supply of petrol and diesel. So oil may rise to, let's say, $100 a barrel.
Wow.
The price of petrol and diesel could go up even more because you are buying finished product. And therein lies the danger. And if we work on that scenario and the fact that if the war continues for very much longer, the American dollar and not necessarily gold will become the new safe haven, which is why you've seen the rand fall to the extent that it has in the last couple of days. So you're then looking at a scenario where you got a very high oil price and a very high rand dollar exchange rate. And that's going to push up oil prices. And it's going to push up the cost of moving goods in South Africa, which means inflation in South Africa will rise as it could around the world. And the dilemma in that regard is that where this year we were looking at potentially 3 interest rate cuts, well, those interest rate cuts will then be off the table. And instead of falling interest rates, we could be looking at rising interest rates. And it's a dilemma that faces not just South Africans, but, people anywhere in the world, that inflation could be the new evil as a result of this conflict.
Regional conflict, global ramifications, I think is what many people need to be looking out for. Stay with us on eNCA. It's obviously a very quickly developing story. It has been since last weekend, of course. We're now almost a week later, already had very serious ramifications when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz and when it comes to the delivery of seafaring vessels. Then, of course, you have the commercial airline perspective as well. But for you and us here in South Africa, the key takeaways, as Aakash has mentioned, is what's going to happen with the rand, dollar, the oil price over the next few weeks. We wait, of course, to see what the next steps are when it comes to this Middle East conflict. Aakash, Bramdeo, thank you very much to him as well. And hopefully, as we leave it there, up north, we're watching it closely. The ramifications, the implications, the outcomes for us here in South Africa might not be felt right now, but strap in, kids. It's probably going to get a little bit bumpy. Thank you very, very much for watching the latest edition of SA Explained.